In this video, we're going to compare two 4K Dolby Vision movies from an Apple TV 4K box versus the same movies on Ultra HD Blu-ray from an Oppo 203 player displayed on two calibrated LG B7 OLED televisions. Hello everyone, my name is Vincent Teo and I'm a TV reviewer and professional calibrator. Today we're going to compare the Apple TV 4K box video output versus the video output of Ultra HD Blu-ray in Dolby Vision on two LG B7 OLED televisions. Now, if you have seen my previous video comparing Dolby Vision and HDR10, the screen on your left is definitely an LG B7, a 65-inch OLED 65B7V, which is the UK version. But unfortunately, I don't have the metal plate that connects the panel to its crescent stand, so I have to lean it against the wall. I've crafted an advertisement for this television. I spent lots of time crafting it, so I might as well just run it again right now. Okay, let's get back to what this comparison is all about. There may be a few video enthusiasts out there who are interested in buying the new Apple TV 4K box to watch 4K movies in HDR, but they are wondering whether the image quality can match or come close to Ultra HD Blu-ray. So today we're going to do the comparison. I've selected two movies here, which are Transformers: The Last Knight and also Spider-Man: Homecoming, and I selected these two particular movies because these are two movies that are actually available in Dolby Vision on Ultra HD Blu-ray, and they are also available in Dolby Vision on the Apple TV 4K box on iTunes. So it allows us to compare like for like, and I try to minimize as much variable as possible. So just to give you an idea of the setup here, the Apple TV 4K box is outputting in 4K Dolby Vision at 60 Hz, whereas the Oppo 203 Ultra HD Blu-ray player is outputting in 12-bit Dolby Vision. And the two LG B7 OLED are 65 inches and they are both calibrated for Dolby Vision, so hopefully the picture quality will look similar and we remove all the variables from the equation, so any difference that you see hopefully will be down to Ultra HD Blu-ray versus iTunes streaming from an Apple TV 4K box. So without further ado, let's get into the comparison. So both of these TVs are LG 65-inch B7 OLED and they are both displaying Spider-Man: Homecoming in Dolby Vision. The screen on your left here is displaying Spider-Man: Homecoming in Dolby Vision from an Ultra HD Blu-ray played through an Oppo 203, and the screen on your right here is playing it in Dolby Vision from an Apple TV 4K box through streaming. Now let me just show you on the screen on your left here that it is actually in Dolby Vision. You can see that it is Dolby Vision 12-bit if I long press the Oppo remote info button. And on the screen on your right here, I've actually enabled a playback info HUD or heads-up display from the Apple TV 4K box. And what is interesting is that this opening menu video loop is actually in SDR and is only in HD resolution 1920 times 1080, and the bit rate tops out at about 13 megabits per second. And it is the Apple TV 4K box that is actually upscaling the source to UHD or ultra high definition resolution and converting it to Dolby Vision to be displayed on the screen. I'll show you that the screen here is actually displaying it in Dolby Vision. Okay, let's move on to the actual movie itself. So we go to the start of the movie, and here I'm going to enable the playback info on the Oppo 203 as well. You can see that the bitrate is running around 50 to 60 megabits per second, whereas on the Apple TV 4K box, it is actually running around 15-16 megabits per second with a peak of around 30 megabits per second. And here you can see that on the Ultra HD Blu-ray is running around now 70 to 80, whereas the Apple TV 4K box is only peaking at around 30 but running at around 60 at the moment, even though I have a bandwidth of around 35 megabits per second. And now that we are in the actual movie itself, you can see that the source is now Dolby Vision and the resolution is UHD already. So it is only the title menu that was in SDR HD. Now that we're in the actual movie itself, the Apple TV 4K box is actually streaming it from an ultra high definition Dolby Vision source. Okay, let me switch off the playback info on both sources, both source devices, and then I'll go in and compare the actual video quality. Okay, so I've paused on this scene relatively early in the movie. It's not an overly bright scene, nor is it an overly dark scene, so it has mixed bright and dark elements. And I'll show you that the screen on the left here is actually displaying it from an Oppo 203. If I long press the info button on the remote control, you can see that it's displaying in Dolby Vision, whereas the screen on the right here is displaying it from an Apple TV 4K box. If I scroll down the touchpad, you can see the information here playing it in 4K Dolby Vision. Now, there's no real night and day difference. Any difference here to my eyes is quite subtle, but what I can see is that from the 4K Blu-ray version, there's just a touch more detail and sharpness in the hair and also in the wrinkles just above her lips. And that's what I can see. It is certainly not a night and day difference between Ultra HD Blu-ray and also streaming from an Apple TV 4K box. On this scene, it's slightly sharper, slightly crisper on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version on certain minor details, tiny details on this relatively bright scene. Now, if I walk up close to both TVs and start scrutinizing the picture, what I can see is that the Ultra HD Blu-ray version is retaining a bit more film grain in the image. On the background here, I can see certainly more film grain in the walls, whereas on the Apple TV 4K version streaming, I think the compression process has removed a bit of the film grain, and so the background here looks a bit cleaner and calmer than the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. Now, some viewers may prefer the cleaner picture of the Apple TV 4K box, but film grain is inherent to how the picture is captured through camera, and therefore film grain integrity is a big part of the reproduction of the directors and the creators' artistic intent. So on this occasion, I would definitely, as a purist and video enthusiast, I would prefer the version that retains the integrity of the film grain. Here I'm comparing a pretty dark scene, and on the left here, as usual, is the Ultra HD Blu-ray of Spider-Man Homecoming being played through an Oppo 203 4K Blu-ray player. I'll just go ahead and show you. It is actually indeed the case, and on the right here, it is an Apple TV 4K box streaming. Right? So from a normal viewing distance, there's only a slight difference, and the difference that I can really see is that on the Apple TV 4K version through streaming, I can see slightly more noise and blockiness, macro blocking in the darker regions of the background. And certainly when I walked up close to analyze, the pixels here are larger, the macro blocking, the blockiness are of a larger shape than the Ultra HD Blu-ray version on your left here. But from a normal viewing distance, there's only a slight increase in terms of the noisiness, and I don't think that it is something that will bother most viewers. And the increase in blockiness and noise on the Apple TV 4K version is entirely due to the lower bitrate that the compression on the Apple TV 4K streaming is using versus the Ultra HD Blu-ray version, which is still running at a quite high bitrate of 51.5 megabits per second. Right, I've enabled the playback info on both the Oppo 203 and also the Apple TV 4K box on both TVs so that we can actually see what's going on. I'm going to hit the play button on the Oppo 203 and the Apple TV 4K box and hope for the best. So as I hit the play button, you can see that the Apple TV, as it kicks into view, the zooming out, there's a slight stutter which slowly goes away. This is because the Apple TV 4K box uses adaptive streaming bitrate, so if your broadband bandwidth is lower, then it will stream at a lower bitrate, but it gradually goes up to its peak bitrate for that particular movie. So for Spider-Man Homecoming, it seems to be running between 15 and 25, even though the indicated bitrate peak is said to be 30, whereas the 4K Blu-ray version is running around 50 to 90 really. I've enabled the playback info on both the Oppo 203 and also the Apple TV 4K box for us to compare the bitrate of Ultra HD Blu-ray and also streaming from iTunes movies. And what we can see here, that on the screen on the left, the bitrate runs somewhere between 50 to 100, whereas on the screen on your right here, which is the Apple TV 4K box, it has a peak bitrate of 25 megabits per second and an average bitrate of only 12 megabits per second, despite having a broadband bandwidth of around 37 megabits per second. But I think the QDH1 codec, I'm not entirely sure what does this stand for, but this is probably Apple's own proprietary encoding codec, is actually doing a fairly decent job in terms of presentation of fine detail and sharpness. Obviously up close it's not going to look as sharp as the Ultra HD Blu-ray version, which has much more bit rate to play with, and it is physical media, so it's not adaptive, which means that it is not subject to your broadband bandwidth. But we'll go ahead and switch off this playback info and compare the image on several frames between Ultra HD Blu-ray and also iTunes movie streaming from an Apple TV 4K box. This is a scene from Transformers. The screen on your left here is playing the Ultra HD Blu-ray in Dolby Vision from an Oppo 203. I'll long press the info button and show you. Okay, you can see that it is playing in Dolby Vision in 12-bit, whereas the screen on the right here is displaying it from an Apple TV 4K box in 4K Dolby Vision. And when comparing side by side, I actually had to walk up to the screen to see the difference. So what I can see is that on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version, the pores on her skin is just slightly more defined, and also there is more texture in the background, whereas on the Apple TV 4K streaming version, the pores are sort of like smoothed out very, very slightly. There's a less three-dimensional effect to the whole picture, and then the texture in the background is slightly scrubbed away as well. But bear in mind that I can only notice these differences really up close to the screen. When I step back to my normal viewing distance, they both look very similar, and clearly there's a slight edge to the Ultra HD Blu-ray rendition because of its higher bit rate that is used here. It runs probably between, let's actually check the bit rate here. So the bit rate for this particular frame here is running at 85.5 megabits per second, whereas we know that from the Apple TV 4K box, the maximum bit rate is going to be 25 megabits per second, and from an analysis of the average, is usually actually running between 15 and 20. So naturally the picture would look more defined with slightly more dimensionality on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. But is it night and day? I would say not. I think if you actually remove one of these screens and do a blind test for most people, they would be hard pressed to tell the difference. Clearly, side by side, from where I'm sitting, I can actually perceive more dimensionality and slightly more sharpness and crispness to the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. But I think the majority of people is going to be very happy with the rendition of the Apple TV 4K box from streaming as well. Now, this is another frame in Transformers where Sir Anthony Hopkins is standing there listening intently, and the screen on your left, as usual, is the one displaying from an Ultra HD Blu-ray. And again, I think any improvement that the Ultra HD Blu-ray version offers over iTunes movie streaming from the Apple TV 4K box is marginal at best from typical viewing distance. Obviously, when I walk up really close to the screen and started analyzing parts of the picture, I can see that there is more texture in his scarf here with more peeling and cross pattern, whereas the streamed version has more of a tendency to actually remove the texture. Also, if you notice these peelers here, the imperfections and also the paint are clearer on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version from an Oppo 203, whereas the one on the Apple TV 4K box is smoother. But from a normal viewing distance, I would say that the difference is really quite marginal, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that anyone can tell obviously which one is streaming and which one is 4K Blu-ray or physical media without walking really up close to the screen and doing some pixel peeping. But one more obvious problem on the Apple TV 4K box is that for some reason the Dolby Vision version of Transformers The Last Knight introduced some brightness fluctuation from time to time on the screen on your right here. The screen on the left is also playing Dolby Vision from an Ultra HD Blu-ray from an Oppo 203 4K Blu-ray player and is quite stable. I hope you can actually see from the camera that the screen on the right here, there's intermittent fluctuation from time to time. Now, if we set the Apple TV 4K box to output in HDR10, then the luminance becomes stable and there's no luminance fluctuation. So I think it may just be a problem with this movie, because Spider-Man Homecoming on the iTunes movie streamed from the Apple TV 4K box was entirely stable as well. So it may just be a problem with Transformers The Last Knight, whether it's an interaction between the Dolby Vision mapping engine on the Apple TV 4K box and this LG 65-inch B7 OLED. Maybe that's a problem. But yes, there's a problem in terms of this movie. You can see that it's just brightened up there and all the dynamic contrast and everything is set to off. In summary, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised by how close the content output from the Apple TV 4K box got to the Ultra HD Blu-ray played through an Oppo 203. Now, obviously, the Ultra HD Blu-ray is going to look better. The image is slightly sharper, slightly crisper, and in dark scenes, there's less macro blocking and less noisiness in terms of the presentation. But from a normal viewing distance, I don't think many people will be able to notice this. I only notice it when I actually pause a scene, got up close to the televisions to scrutinize, and from a normal viewing distance, I don't think many people will be able to notice the slightly cleaner, slightly crisper presentation on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version, which also happens to retain more of the texture in the background as well, versus the Apple TV 4K box, which managed to scrub away some of the texture in the background on both of these movies. Now, the bitrate difference is actually fairly large when you consider the analysis in terms of the playback info. The Ultra HD Blu-ray version is consistently running between 50 and 100 megabits per second, whereas for the Apple TV 4K box from iTunes streaming, even though it is in 4K, for some reason, Spider-Man Homecoming had a slightly higher bitrate than Transformers The Last Knight. I don't know whether it is because I redeemed The Last Knight wrongly on iTunes or whatever, but it is still displaying in 4K ultra high definition in Dolby Vision. But the bitrate for Transformers The Last Knight on the Apple TV 4K box only has a peak of around 25 megabits per second and average between 10 and 18, whereas the Spider-Man Homecoming on the Apple TV 4K box, the peak is around 30 megabits per second and the average is running quite close to the peak in most scenes. Some scenes it dipped to around 12 to 16. And on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version, it's consistently running between 50 and 100 megabits per second. But despite that, I really tried my best to try and find differences, but I really, from a normal viewing distance, couldn't see that much of a difference. Obviously, to my eyes, from a normal viewing distance, the Ultra HD Blu-ray version looks crisper, looks sharper, slightly, and also the texture in the background just has more texture to it, whereas the compression on the Apple TV 4K iTunes version, basically the background is cleaner, but some people may prefer that anyway, and it did not look as sharp. But the most important thing with all these 4K HDR movies is the HDR component rather than the 4K component. And certainly from that point of view, the Apple TV 4K version in Dolby Vision still gives sufficient pop, basically equivalent pop to the picture when compared side by side with the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. Now, we encountered some problems with the Transformers The Last Knight movie, in that in some scenes you can see very noticeable luminance fluctuations, whereas it is entirely stable on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. Now, I've tested it in HDR10 on the Apple TV 4K box and it is entirely stable. I've tested it on another TV as well in HDR10 and it's entirely stable. So I don't know whether it is the Dolby Vision component of it, the mapping engine of the Apple TV 4K box interacting with this LG OLED that is introducing this luminance fluctuation, but that is certainly not present on the Ultra HD Blu-ray version. But there are other things as well when you consider in terms of your viewing experience, because I'm only talking in terms of pure picture quality. So I think the Apple TV 4K box, regardless of whether it's bright scenes or dark scenes, regardless of whether it's a slow moving scene, macro shot, or a fast action scene, it got actually quite close to the Ultra HD Blu-ray despite its lower bitrate. And maybe part of the reason is because of this QDH1 codec that Apple is using. I don't know what it actually stands for, but it seems to be doing an extremely good job to get close to the video output of the Ultra HD Blu-ray. But there are other things to consider as well, such as that the Apple TV 4K box currently do not support Dolby Atmos, whereas the Ultra HD Blu-ray disc and also the players can actually output in Dolby Atmos. Other considerations are that we found that from the Apple TV 4K box, occasionally there might be some lip sync issue, but some tweaking of the settings on the LG B7 OLED managed to resolve this. Another potential issue for users, if you're not using 2017 LG OLED, is that because the Apple TV 4K box has a fixed video output, so it will convert everything to 4K 60 Hz. Usually that is the maximum that is enabled on your television, on modern HDR televisions. So 24 frames per second movies may present some stutter, but the good thing about this LG OLED is that they can recover 24 cadence from a 60 frames per second content, so it still looks as smooth as 24 frames per second content can be, compared with the 24 frames per second output from the Ultra HD Blu-ray player. So I've covered Dolby Atmos, I've covered frame rates, and I've covered the lip sync issue. And in terms of the convenience, there's no doubt the reason people get into streaming is because of convenience. And with the Apple TV 4K box, the interface is very polished, it's a very smooth UI, and it certainly can get into the movie fairly quickly and start playing. And I need to also warn people that the Apple TV 4K box is actually using an adaptive or variable bitrate streaming. So let's say if your broadband is not fast enough, it will drop to a lower bitrate. With the Ultra HD Blu-ray player, obviously the bitrate is as high as they can be. It's on a physical media and it's not adaptive at all. But it is more of a hassle to watch a movie, certainly, because you have to get up from your sofa, put in a disc, load the tray, and then maybe you have to sit through copyright notice or trailers that are unskippable, whereas with the Apple TV 4K box it's certainly much more convenient. You get straight into the movie. But in a nutshell, I think what I would say is that I'm pleasantly surprised by the video quality of the Apple TV 4K box. Obviously this is only based on 2 movies that are available in Dolby Vision on both formats, on both Ultra HD Blu-ray and also on Apple TV 4K. But based on these 2 movies, I'm pleasantly surprised and I'm relatively impressed by the Apple TV 4K box in terms of the video quality. If you found this video useful, please click the like button and subscribe to the HD TV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching.
I've been searching, follow every step, every road, every single trace.